Hello, tonight I'm going to be discussing a little bit about the divisions of the central nervous system. We're going to be focusing mainly on the autonomic nervous system and its two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And then we can also brush over a couple other things. So let me just write this out. There's a there's a thing that I like to look at. We have our autonomic nervous system, and we have our somatic nervous system. Um, and the autonomic is kind of split into parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest, digest, and the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight. The somatic nervous system is another branch off of the central nervous system, which comes off of the spinal cord. But the somatic nervous system is going to handle more motor and sensory functions. Um, and another difference is that the autonomic nervous system uses a two neuron system. Meanwhile, the somatic nervous system is just going to take one neuron and extend it to skeletal muscle. So that's one of our main differences. Let's start comparing the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems here. Um, the place that they origin at, if we draw our spinal cord here, and then a top view of the spinal cord, um, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are going to originate in different places. The sympathetic nervous system is going to originate from about T1 to L2 or L3, and the parasympathetic nervous system is going to be mostly in the cranial and sacral parts of the spinal cord. So they're both going to originate in different places. The sympathetic nervous system is going to originate here in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. And what it's going to do is, it does have some exceptions, but usually what's going to happen is it's going to originate here, it's going to come out, and once it hits this thing called the sympathetic chain ganglia, it's going to synapse with its postganglionic neuron, and then that neuron will go on to whatever structure that it's going to be affecting. So it's going to be, this is how it connects from the central nervous system to the effector. Um, there are other cases um, where it will actually originate, it'll pass completely through the sympathetic chain ganglia. Oh, sorry. And then it'll go to something called a collateral ganglia. And that would be only when it is going to places in the abdominopelvic cavity. But for the most part, it's going to be the sympathetic chain ganglia. There is an exception for the sympathetic chain ganglia, and that's when it goes to sweat glands. It goes with spinal nerves. So if the sympathetic chain or the sympathetic nervous system neuron is going to innervate the sweat glands on the skin, it'll join a spinal nerve at the sympathetic chain ganglia, which is here, and then go on to innervate the sweat gland. Meanwhile, the parasympathetic chain ganglia is going to originate, and it's going to actually have a longer pre synaptic neuron, and let me just label this real quick. So the PNS is going to have a longer pre, which should be myelinated, and then it's actually going to synapse on or near the organ that it's going to. So say this is the stomach, then it would synapse right near the stomach, and then that postsynaptic ganglia is going to go and immediately release neurotransmitters into the stomach to have an effect. And notice how that postsynaptic terminal is not myelinated. But when it comes to the sympathetic chain ganglia, or the sympathetic nervous system, sorry, the presynaptic the presynaptic neuron is going to be shorter, still myelinated, and it's going to synapse, like I said before, usually in that chain ganglia or collateral ganglia, and then it's going to have a longer postsynaptic until it gets to its effector. Also unmyelinated. There is another exception for the sympathetic nervous system, and that is if it's going to the medulla of the adrenal gland. If that happens, it's actually going to just be a one neuron system. It's going to go straight into that adrenal gland. We'll kind of draw it like that. It's going to release some acetylcholine, and it's actually going to synapse with the cells inside this gland. And what's going to happen is we have a vein right here, or an artery. That one's going to actually release epinephrine into the blood flow. So that's the only time that this is not a two neuron system, is with the sympathetic nervous system going to the medulla of the adrenal gland. Okay, so now I want to go over some of the types of receptors that we can have in these neurons. So, as far as the receptors go, we're going to have two different types of receptors. There's going to be cholinergic and adrenergic. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce those. Adrenergic. And the way that I remember them is cholinergic sounds like acetylcholine. So I know that acetylcholine is going to be what binds to the cholinergic. And with adrenergic, I know that adrenaline is going to bind to that, or in other words, epinephrine or norepinephrine. So those are the neurotransmitters that'll bind. So I'll just write those below. So ACH is going to bind to cholinergic, and norepinephrine and epinephrine, or in other words, adrenaline, are going to bind to the adrenergic receptors. If we continue this here, there's a couple more divisions. Cholinergic is going to be divided into nicotinic and muscarinic. And then the nicotinic will have two divisions, and one, which is mainly one that we haven't covered yet, it has to do with skeletal muscle, and then N2, which is one that we have dealt with. That's the N2 is going to be the main receptor when these, if we look here, when these synapses happen with the pre and post ganglionic neuron, on the post ganglionic neuron, it's going to be N2 receptors taking in that acetylcholine. As far as muscarine goes, there's actually 5 different receptors. And then if we go over to adrenergic, we have 2 divisions over here as well. We've got alpha and beta. Alpha is going to be split into 2, alpha 1, alpha 2. Beta is also going to be split into 3. And then a couple similarities and differences here. So the nicotinic receptor is actually a ligand gated channel, ion channel, which is different from muscarine alpha and beta, or muscarinic alpha and beta, because these are all going to be G protein receptors. Okay, and basically what a G protein receptor is going to be is basically a cascading signal that's going to use ATP to create more of the CAMP in the cell. As we continue on here, just want to review the question real quick, make sure I haven't missed anything. Let's cover a little bit about the neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters that we're going to be worried about, like I mentioned before, are going to be acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. And I want to go over when each of these is important. So let me just draw out for SNS. Say we have a neuron right here, that's the body. It's going to synapse. And then go to its effector organ, wherever it's going. What's going to happen here, like I said before, is acetylcholine is going to be released from the presynaptic ganglia, neuron, not ganglia. And like I mentioned before, there's going to be little receptors here called N2 nicotinic receptors that are going to let the ACH in, cause an action potential that continues down, and that will cause a release of, let me find a good color, of norepinephrine. And in this case, Because norepinephrine is adrenaline, it's going to go to an adrenergic receptor. So anything with alpha or beta, if this organ has alpha or beta receptors, it will take in the norepinephrine and the desired effect will be completed. Now, like I mentioned before, there are some exceptions. For example, let's just copy and paste this whole thing. When the SNS goes with skeletal muscle, or goes to the sweat glands, it's going to be following a spinal nerve, and it'll release ACH right here, but instead of releasing norepinephrine right here, it's going to actually release ACH again. And that is what's going to cause sweating. And since it's ACH, acetylcholine, that's going to be cholinergic receptor. Cholinergic receptor. In this case, it would be M3 is the receptor. So yeah, based on the receptor, we can predict based on the neurotransmitter, we can predict what receptor will be best. If we do one of these for the parasympathetic nervous system, we can draw this out. It's going to be much longer, actually. Synapse. Same thing's going to happen with the presynaptic neuron. There's going to be ACH released. And then the postganglionic neuron is going to be shorter. And it's also going to release some ACH, which will be received by any muscotinic receptor that we might need on any of our organs, glands, whatever it's going to. So each of these neurotransmitters is going to bind to a different receptor, and each receptor actually has preferred neurotransmitters that it likes. For example, there's alpha 1, 2, 3, or alpha 1, 2, beta 1, 2, 3. But obviously all of these are going to be able to bind to norepinephrine and epinephrine, but some of them will like epinephrine better than others. For example, beta 1 likes norepinephrine and epinephrine equally, but beta 2 is actually going to favor epinephrine more, if I'm not mistaken. And then beta 3, norepinephrine more than epinephrine. So depending on what receptor, or depending on what neurotransmitter, different receptors are going to be available. And it looks like that's all I have for today. We were able to cover the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, their points of origin, their number of neurons in the pathway, the location of their ganglia, the neurotransmitters involved, the types of receptors, their actions, and talk about the different subdivisions of all of these receptors and neurotransmitters. So thank you for listening, and have